She wanted the rules bent for her, but when a neighbor refused, she dialed 911. What happened next flipped the whole neighborhood against her. The sound of the gate sliding shut echoed across the entrance of the Stonehaven Estates subdivision in Tempe, Arizona. Cars rolled past on McClintock Drive, their headlights blinking on, one by one. But right there at the gate, two strangers were locked in a standoff. Excuse me, sir." The sharp voice of Janice Kettleman cut through the air. At 61, she carried herself with the air of someone used to being obeyed. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her HOA badge clipped proudly to her cardigan, as if it gave her the same authority as law enforcement. The man she was calling after had his hand on the key fob to his SUV, about to step inside. He turned, calm, but visibly tired from the day. Maurice Dunley, 44, software consultant, homeowner here for nearly a decade, lived less than 3 blocks inside those gates. His briefcase hung loosely at his side, his sleeves rolled up from hours at his desk. "Yes," Morris asked, his voice even, his eyes steady. Janice walked quickly toward him, holding her purse with one hand and gesturing with the other. "Be a gentleman and open that gate for me. I left my card at home." Morris looked at him for a moment, then back at the gate. "I can't do that, ma'am. HOA rules say we're not supposed to let anyone in without a card or security clearance. You'll need to call the guard station." Janice blinked at him as if he had spoken in another language. "Excuse me? I live here? I've been on the board for 12 years. Are you seriously going to stand there and not let me in?" Morris shifted his briefcase to the other hand, his patience clear but firm. "Rules apply to everyone. I'm not risking a fine because someone doesn't have their card. Security will let you in if you give them your address." Her face reddened. The audacity, she thought, to stand there and deny her entry to her own neighborhood. "You're being difficult," she snapped. "You don't get to decide who lives here." Morris tilted his head slightly, almost amused at her choice of words. "I don't? That's exactly why I'm telling you to call the number posted right there on the gate. It's not personal, it's procedure." Janice's lips pressed into a thin line. To her, this wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about being challenged. She wasn't used to being told no, and certainly not by someone she had decided, in that split-second judgment, didn't belong. "I'm not going to stand here and argue with you," she said, pulling her phone from her bag. "If you won't let me in, I'll call the police. Let them sort it out." Morris let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but more out of disbelief. "You're really going to call 911 because I followed the rules?" She didn't answer. Her thumb was already dialing. Morris shook his head slowly. He knew exactly how this would sound on the other end of the line. He'd seen enough news stories, read enough accounts, to know where things like this could go. And yet here it was happening to him on the street where he paid taxes, HOA fees, and even landscaped his front yard according to their strict, color-coded guidelines. Janice stepped a few paces away, her voice rising as the dispatcher picked up. "Yes, I need an officer at the entrance of Stonehaven Estates. There's a man here, African-American, mid-40s maybe. He's blocking me from entering my own neighborhood. He's acting suspicious." Maurice froze in that moment, not out of fear, but out of a bitter recognition. He had been reduced to a suspicious man in the very place he called home. He rubbed his forehead, muttering to himself, "Unbelievable." Inside the dispatch center on the other side of town, fluorescent lights glared over rows of operators fielding emergency calls. One of them was Tanya Ridgmond, headset snug over her ears, pen poised over her notepad. She had already answered 6 calls in the last hour. Car accidents, a domestic argument, a shoplifting report. When the line connected, she straightened in her chair,
her voice steady with practiced calm. 911, what's your emergency? Janice's complaint spilled into Tanya's ear like an unsteady river. Details, accusations, half-truths. Tanya's pen scribbled notes, but her brow furrowed the moment she heard the description. African-American male, mid-40s, refusing to let me in. Then the address. Stonehaven Estates. Tanya sat upright, her pulse picked up. That's where she lived, and mid-40s, African-American? She leaned forward, straining against the noise of the call center around her. She repeated the information carefully, her voice professional, though her chest felt tight. Ma'am, you're saying there's a man preventing you from entering your neighborhood? Can you describe him again? Janice huffed on the line. Tall, dark jacket, briefcase in his hand. He's standing there like he owns the place. He looks suspicious to me. Tanya's stomach dropped. She knew that description. She knew the briefcase, the jacket, the exact way her husband carried himself after a long day. Morris. Her pen stopped moving. She stared at the notepad as the reality sunk in. She was listening to a stranger call her husband suspicious for standing in front of his own home. But Tanya couldn't let her voice break, not here, not in this room filled with other dispatchers, listening, recording, responding. She took a breath, gripping her pen so tightly the plastic bent. She needed to think fast, because this was no longer a routine call. But what Janice didn't realize, and what Tanya was only beginning to process, was that this 911 call wasn't about to end the way she imagined. The dispatch center buzzed with overlapping voices and keyboard clicks, but Tanya tuned it all out. Her headset carried only Janice's voice, sharp, breathless, dripping with certainty that she was in danger. Tanya's training told her to listen carefully, to remain calm, to treat every caller as credible until proven otherwise. But her instincts screamed at her that this wasn't an emergency. This was her husband. Ma'am, Tanya said, her tone clipped but polite, I need you to stay calm and explain clearly. You're saying a man won't let you into the gated entrance of your community. Janice didn't hesitate. That's exactly right. He's standing there just refusing to help. He has no right to stop me. I've lived here for over 20 years, and I'm on the HOA board. He's loitering. The word stung. Loitering? Morris had spent years building his career, working late nights at his computer so their family could afford to live in this very neighborhood. He wasn't loitering. He was heading home, same as anyone else. Okay, Tanya said carefully, trying to keep her emotions out of it. I'll need you to answer a few questions so I can send the appropriate response. First, are you in immediate danger? Janice sighed dramatically. Well, he's standing there right in front of me, isn't he? He's glaring at me like I'm the one causing trouble. Morris, standing a few feet away, heard every word. His jaw tightened. He hadn't moved except to lean against his car. His arms were folded now, more out of disbelief than aggression. He wanted to interrupt, to shout into her phone, but he knew better. Words twisted easily when filtered through fear, or, in Janice's case, pride. Ma'am, Tanya pressed her voice steady. Has he threatened you in any way? There was a pause. Then Janice answered, not with words, no, but his attitude is threatening enough. Morris let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. He looked toward the gate camera overhead, knowing it recorded everything. At least there would be proof.
Tanya heard that pause in Janice's voice, the subtle shift when exaggeration tried to dress itself as fact. She marked it down in her notes, but kept her tone neutral. Understood. Officers will be dispatched to your location. Please remain where you are. Janice sounded almost satisfied. Thank you. Finally. The call ended, but Tanya didn't lower her headset. She closed her eyes for half a second, gripping the edge of her desk. She needed to breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to pick up the phone and call Maurice.
Directly warn him that officers were already being sent. But she couldn't break protocol. Dispatchers were never supposed to insert themselves personally. Still, this wasn't just anyone. This was her husband. Across town, 2 officers responded to the call. Officer Glenn Ortega, a 10-year veteran of the Tempe Police Department, and Officer Rachel Bowers, newer to the force, but sharp and eager. Their cruiser turned onto McClintock, lights flickering as they approached the gated entrance. Inside the dispatch center, Tanya watched their names pop up on her monitor. Her pulse thumped in her throat. She had worked with Glenn before. He wasn't a bad officer, but he leaned heavily on caller statements, often assuming the victim was always telling the truth. That worried her. Morris, meanwhile, leaned back against his SUV, phone in hand. He had already texted Tanya, "You won't believe what's happening right now." But of course, Tanya already knew. She typed a quick reply with her free hand under the desk. "I got the call." He looked at the screen, then back toward Janice, who was pacing with her phone still clutched in her hand, as if waiting for backup. "You called 911 because I didn't open a gate?" Morris said aloud, voice calm but incredulous. Janice spun toward him. "I called because you're making me uncomfortable. You think you can stand there and tell me what I can or can't do in my own neighborhood? That's suspicious behavior, and I won't be intimidated." Morris raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious for following the same rules you enforce on everyone else? You've got to be kidding me." She crossed her arms, chin tilted high. "You don't get to talk to me that way. You don't know who you're dealing with." He almost laughed. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Headlights appeared at the edge of the road. The cruiser rolled up, blue and red lights flickering across the gate. The situation, tense enough already, was about to escalate. In the dispatch center, Tanya clenched her jaw, her fingers trembling as she typed updates into the system. She knew exactly how fragile moments like this could be, how quickly things spiraled when perception and prejudice collided. Morris straightened his posture, setting his briefcase inside his SUV, just in case things went sideways. He pulled out his wallet, holding his driver's license between 2 fingers, ready to prove himself, once again in a place where proof should never have been necessary. But the arrival of flashing lights didn't cool things down. It only magnified the tension that was already crackling at the gate. The cruiser came to a slow stop, headlights throwing long streaks of white across the gate. Officer Glenn Ortega stepped out first, his hand resting near his holster, posture solid. Officer Rachel Bowers followed, her flashlight snapping on as she scanned the scene. Both officers immediately spotted Morris, standing calmly by his SUV, and Janice, waving her arm like a referee demanding attention. "There he is," Janice shouted, her voice carrying across the entrance. "That's the man I called about. He refused to let me into my neighborhood." Morris kept his hands visible, his license still pinched between his fingers. He didn't move toward them, didn't want to risk misinterpretation. "Evening, officers,"
he said evenly. "Name's Maurice Dunley. I live right here in Stonehaven. I'm just coming home from work." Officer Ortega's eyes flicked from Maurice to Janice, then back again. "Sir, we'll need to check that out. Just stay right there." Inside the dispatch center, Tanya's headset crackled as the officers radioed their arrival. She tracked every word, her stomach tightening with each second. Her monitor displayed the call log. Suspicious male, refusing entry. Caller feels unsafe. And then Morris's calm voice filtering through the system. It was his voice. Clear, steady, unmistakable. Her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the desk. She muttered under her breath, barely audible, "Oh, God, it really is him." Beside her, another dispatcher shot her a glance. "You good?" Tanya forced a nod, tugging her notepad back into place.
Yeah, just a long night. She couldn't let her emotions spill here, not where everyone could see. Back at the gate, Janice stepped closer to the officers, eager to state her case. "I've been a homeowner here for decades. I lost my card tonight, and she pointed toward Morris, refused to let me in. He was rude, dismissive, and he's been loitering here instead of helping." Morris's eyebrows rose slightly, but his tone stayed even. "With all respect, officer, I wasn't loitering. I was going home. She asked me to break HOA rules and open the gate without identification. I said no. That's all that happened." Officer Bowers tilted her flashlight downward, scanning Morris's briefcase, his vehicle, his ID. She caught the tension in his jaw, but also the restraint in his body language. She glanced at Ortega, then back at Janice. "Ma'am," Bowers asked, "you said he threatened you." Janice hesitated. "Well, not exactly, but his presence was intimidating." Morris let out a breath, shaking his head. "Presence. That's what this is about." He held his ID out, extending his arm so they wouldn't have to approach. "Look, you can check my address. It's on Amberwood Drive, 3 blocks from here." Ortega took the license, shining his flashlight across it. He compared the photo with Maurice's face, then glanced toward the address. "It checks out." Janice's face reddened. "You're just going to take his word for it?" Maurice gave a small, tired laugh. "It's not my word. It's state-issued ID." The tension cracked the air like static. Back at the dispatch center, Tanya's heart pounded. She wanted to shout through the line, to defend Morris, to call out Janice's twisting of facts, but she couldn't. Her role required neutrality. Still, she couldn't stop herself from typing a quiet note into the system. Caller statement, inconsistent, suspect cooperative, produced ID immediately. The officers moved slowly, assessing. Ortega walked a few steps toward Janice. "Ma'am, did he ever touch you? Blocked your path physically or make verbal threats?" "No, but," Janice began. "Then what exactly did he do?" Ortega pressed. Her lips quivered. The authority she'd carried minutes ago began to waver. "He just wouldn't let me in. He looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. Isn't that enough?" Bowers lowered her flashlight, her expression unreadable. "That's not grounds for an emergency call, ma'am." Morris exhaled slowly, relief flickering through him, though the frustration burned hotter underneath. He looked at Janice, shaking his head. "All this because I said no?" Janice's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her certainty had begun to fray. Inside the dispatch center, Tanya scribbled a final note, her hand steadier now. Relief trickled in, but it wasn't enough. She knew how easily things could still spiral. Morris tucked his wallet back into his pocket, his voice measured. "Officers, I've got nothing else to add. Unless she wants to file a formal complaint, I'd like to go home to my family." Ortega nodded slowly, but Janice wasn't ready to let go.
She clutched her purse tighter, desperation flickering in her eyes. You can't just let him walk away. What kind of example does that set? Maurice turned to face her fully, his words quiet but cutting. The example it sets is simple. You don't get to call the police every time someone doesn't do what you want. The silence that followed was louder than anything yet, but even with Maurice's eye cleared and the officers leaning toward closure, Tanya could feel it. This confrontation wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The air hung thick at the gated entrance, the glow of the police cruiser's lights flickering across the stucco walls and palm trees lining the street. Neighbors had begun to gather. Porch lights flicked on, blinds tilted open, and a few curious faces peeked from doorways. Stonehaven Estates wasn't known for late-night drama, and now the drama had arrived at its front gate. Officer Ortega shifted his weight, still holding Maurice's ID in his hand. His years on the job had taught him that people often called the police for things that weren't crimes.
But those same years had also taught him how dangerous it could be to downplay a complaint, especially when a caller insisted she felt threatened. He turned toward Janice. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but from what I see, this gentleman has done nothing illegal. He has every right to be here." Janice bristled, her voice climbing an octave. "Are you saying my word means nothing? I'm telling you I felt unsafe. Isn't that what matters?" Her words carried across the street, and a couple walking their dog slowed down to listen. Maurice remained silent, standing by his SUV with arms folded, but his eyes swept toward the growing audience. He knew how this looked, how quickly assumptions spread. Officer Bowers stepped in, her tone calm but direct. "Feeling uncomfortable isn't the same as being in danger, ma'am. We respond to emergencies. If there was no threat, no attempt to harm you, then this call might not have been appropriate." Janice's jaw worked as though chewing on a bitter taste. "So now I'm being scolded for calling the police? I followed the rules. I reported suspicious behavior. What if he was an intruder? What if he was dangerous? Then what?" Maurice finally spoke up, his voice controlled but firm. "Suspicious to you or actually suspicious? There's a difference. You asked me to break a rule that I'd get fined for if I did. I said no, that's all this is." His tone wasn't loud, but the weight behind it carried. Neighbors shuffled closer, phones now raised to record. Janice glanced at the cameras, panic flashing in her eyes. She had called expecting validation, not public spectacle. Inside the dispatch center, Tanya scribbled faster, noting every exchange as Ortega and Bowers reported back over the radio. Her heart hammered. It was surreal. Her husband's calm, measured words traveling across her headset like any other caller's. But he wasn't just another caller. This was personal. Ortega radioed in. "Subject produced valid ID. Residence confirmed. No threat observed. Caller claims intimidation, but provides no evidence of criminal activity." Tanya heard the words and felt a small wave of relief wash over her shoulders. But relief wasn't enough. She knew all too well how fast things could still turn when pride and prejudice clashed under flashing blue lights. Maurice glanced at the growing crowd, then looked back at Ortega. "Officer, if we're done here, I'd like to go home. My family is waiting on me." Janice nearly gasped. "You can't just let him go. That sends the wrong message. People like him." She stopped herself, but the words hung heavy in the night air. "People like him?" Bowers caught it. So did Ortega. So did every neighbor within earshot. A murmur rippled through the small crowd, the kind of collective sound people make when they hear something they're not sure they should have heard. But everyone knows
They did. Maurice turned toward her, his face set in stone. People like me, you mean homeowners? Fathers? Professionals? Or do you mean something else? Janice stammered, her confidence faltering. That's not what— Yes, it is, Maurice interrupted softly, his voice cutting through her excuse. That's exactly what you meant. Ortega looked at Janice for a long moment, then back at Maurice. He didn't need a transcript to know where this was going. Ma'am, Ortega said, his tone shifting. Calling 911 is a serious matter. We're not here to settle HOA disputes or enforce neighborhood favoritism. If this continues, you could be cited for misuse of emergency services. Janice's eyes widened, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly tilted. Cited for trying to protect myself? Bowers crossed her arms, stepping closer. Protecting yourself is one thing. Misusing 911 is another, ma'am. These calls take officers away from real emergencies. Domestic violence, medical crises, accidents. Lives could be at risk elsewhere while we're standing here because of a lost gate card. The weight of her words settled in the air. A neighbor filming shook their head, muttering under their breath. Another whispered, "She really called the cops for this?" Maurice didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his stance, lowering his arms.
This didn't have to go this far. A phone call to security would have solved everything. Janice's face flushed deep red. The authority she wielded as an HOA board member seemed paper-thin now under the glare of flashing lights and neighborhood stares. Back in the dispatch center, Tanya leaned back, her heart slowing just enough to let her think clearly again. She scribbled one last note. Officers reminding caller of misuse policy. Situation stable, no escalation. And yet, as she removed her pen from the paper, a knowing thought tugged at her. This wasn't over. Janice Kettleman wasn't the type to back down gracefully. But before the officers could finalize their decision, the crowd's murmurs began to swell, and the story of what really happened at the gate started to spill beyond this single night. The air was tense enough to feel heavy, like a storm that hadn't quite broken. The flashing red and blue lights danced across the stucco walls, illuminating faces that had begun to gather near the entrance. By now, at least a dozen neighbors stood within view. Some leaned against their cars, parked along the curb, while others filmed quietly with their phones, the glow of their screens reflecting in their glasses. Morris stood near his SUV, shoulders squared but calm. He wasn't here to entertain theatrics. He was simply waiting for this circus to end so he could finally go home. But Janice wasn't finished. Her voice carried sharp and brittle as she addressed the officers again. "Look around," Janice said, gesturing to the small crowd. "Do you think this is how a homeowner should behave? Making his neighbors uncomfortable? Blocking me from going where I have every right to go?" Morris exhaled slowly, then turned to her directly. "What part of following the rules makes me suspicious, Janice? I didn't block you. I didn't touch you. I didn't threaten you. I told you what everyone here already knows. You need a card or security clearance. That's it." His tone wasn't raised, but the firmness in his voice traveled. A man across the street muttered, "Sounds like common sense to me." Another whispered to his wife, "She really called 911 for this?" Officer Ortega lifted a hand, trying to steady the exchange. "All right, let's keep this civil." He turned to Janice. "Ma'am, you understand that this gentleman has proven he lives here.
He's produced ID, his address matches. This is not a criminal issue. Janice's lips pressed into a hard line. So you're just going to ignore how he treated me? The arrogance? The disrespect? Morris gave a short, incredulous laugh. Disrespect? You asked me to break a rule. I said no. That's not arrogance, that's compliance. A woman from the crowd called out, "He's right, Janice." She was standing near the gate, arms folded, her phone still recording. HOA sends letters every month reminding us not to let people in without ID. You've fined 3 households for it yourself. All heads turned toward her. Janice froze, her authority crumbling in the face of her own enforcement record being thrown back at her. Morris's eyes lingered on Janice. So when you fine people for doing the exact thing you asked me to do, that's what leadership? Her mouth opened, then closed again. No words came out. Officer Bowers stepped closer, lowering her flashlight. "Mr. Dunley, you're free to go. We've verified your identity. You've cooperated fully." She turned to Janice. "Ma'am, we need to be clear. 911 is for emergencies. Misuse of the system not only ties up resources, but could cost lives. Do you understand?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on Janice. She shifted uncomfortably, clutching her purse strap as if it might hold her up. Janice's voice trembled slightly now. "So I'm just supposed to, what? Stand here and be made a fool of?" Morris looked at her, his voice softer this time. "No one made you a fool. You did that when you turned this into something it never was." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the low hum of the cruiser's engine. Even Ortega looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. Then a young neighbor in a baseball cap spoke up.
His phone still recording. "This is exactly why people don't trust HOA leadership anymore. Rules for everyone else, but special treatment for yourself." That landed hard. Janice's cheeks flushed scarlet as she glanced around, realizing the narrative was slipping out of her control. The very neighbors she had expected to back her were quietly, or not so quietly, siding with Maurice. In the dispatch center, Tanya heard Ortega's report filtering back through her headset. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths as relief began to mix with pride. Maurice had kept his cool, even under the weight of accusations and flashing lights. That was who he was, measured, patient, unwilling to let someone else's prejudice define him. Still, she couldn't relax yet. The call wasn't closed. Not officially. She scribbled more notes, crowd present. Caller credibility questioned by neighbors. Subject cleared. Maurice shifted his stance, sliding his briefcase back into the SUV. He didn't want to stand here any longer than necessary. He wanted to go home, see Tanya. Let their daughter finish her homework at the kitchen table without knowing how close this night had come to spiraling out of control. But before he could climb into the driver's seat, Janice snapped, her voice shrill enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "This isn't over, Maurice. You can't just embarrass me in front of the whole neighborhood and walk away like nothing happened. People will remember this." Maurice stopped mid-step, turning to look at her one last time. "You're right," he said quietly, but with a finality that carried weight. "They will remember, just maybe not the way you think."
The words lingered, heavier than the flashing lights, heavier than the murmurs. But even as the officers began to wrap things up, the cracks in Janice's story were about to split wider, and what she had tried to frame as suspicion was about to be exposed for what it truly was. Officer Ortega spoke into his radio, his voice low but steady, relaying that the situation appeared non-criminal. The crowd lingered anyway, sensing there was more to see. The tension at the gate wasn't just about rules anymore. It had grown into a mirror held up to the entire neighborhood. Janice fidgeted with the strap of her purse, her earlier bravado slipping. Still, she wasn't ready to surrender her ground. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking, but still loud enough for the onlookers. "I was intimidated. That matters. Doesn't a woman's safety matter anymore?" Maurice's head tilted slightly, his expression almost disbelieving. "Safety, Janice? The only thing I did was say no. If that's intimidation to you, maybe the problem isn't me." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. One neighbor, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt, spoke up from the sidelines. "Come on, Janice. Everyone here knows Morris lives on Amberwood. He's walked his kid to school with us. He's part of this community." Janice spun toward the man, her eyes wide with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "So you're all taking his side now. You don't know what it felt like standing there with him glaring at me." Maurice let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Glaring? I was standing next to my car, tired from work. That's all. You called 911 because of a look?" Officer Bowers cut in, her voice firm. "Ma'am, we're not here to referee feelings. Our job is to determine if there was a crime. So far, there's no evidence of one." Janice's face tightened, her eyes darting from the officers to the recording phones aimed at her. Every second was being documented, and she knew it. Her attempt to control the narrative was slipping through her fingers like sand. Maurice adjusted his stance, speaking louder now so the crowd could hear. "This is what happens when assumptions are weaponized. Instead of calling security like everyone else, you called the police and painted me as a threat in front of my neighbors, in front of my family's community." The words landed hard. Tanya, listening through the headset back at the dispatch center, felt her throat tighten.
She could picture Maurice standing there, his briefcase at his side, the weight of years of restraint, condensed into that single moment. Officer Ortega flipped Maurice's ID closed and handed it back. "Sir, you're cleared. You're free to go about your evening." Maurice took the card, sliding it into his wallet, but his eyes stayed locked on Janice. "I don't need an apology, Janice, but I need you to understand what you did. You escalated a minor inconvenience into a police matter because you didn't like being told no." Janice's mouth opened, then closed again. She wanted to argue, to push back, but every eye was on her. Every phone was recording, and her words no longer carried the weight she thought they did. One woman from the back of the crowd, someone Maurice recognized from the HOA meetings, spoke up. "Janice, you've written letters about enforcing rules. You fined us over paint colors and lawn lengths. How can you call 911 asking someone to break those same rules?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Ortega and Bowers didn't step in, letting the weight of the hypocrisy hang in the air. Maurice finally turned toward his car door, pulling it open. He didn't want to drag this out any longer. But before climbing in, He looked back once more. "Next time you want help, ask like a neighbor, not like an accuser." Tanya's chest swelled with both pride and fear as she heard those words in real time. Pride because Morris had spoken truth without losing his composure. Fear because she knew Janice well enough, from years of similar calls, that people like her rarely left things alone. The officers began to disperse the small crowd, urging neighbors to head back to their homes. Some lingered longer, whispering in groups, but eventually the glow of porch lights dimmed as people trickled back inside. Janice stood frozen, her face burning as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the night. Her authority, once untouchable, now felt like glass that had just cracked under pressure. Ortega offered her one last word before stepping back into the cruiser. "Ma'am, think carefully before you use 911 again. If it's not a real emergency, there are consequences." The door shut, and the cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its lights fading into the distance. Maurice climbed into his SUV, closing the door quietly, his reflection catching in the rearview mirror. He sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, before finally pulling forward through the gate toward Amberwood Drive. At the dispatch center, Tanya removed her headset for the first time in hours, her palms slick with sweat. She stared at the computer screen, replaying every second, relief mixed with a sharper ache, because she knew this incident wasn't just another call. It was a mirror of a deeper issue that lived under the surface of their community, waiting for moments like this to come roaring out. But as Maurice drove home, and Tanya logged the call to close it out, Janice's pride wouldn't let her let the matter rest, and the unraveling of her story was only about to get worse. Maurice drove slowly down Amberwood Drive, his headlights cutting across manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. His hand stayed tight on the wheel, the rhythm of his breathing still uneven. He'd faced long work days, impossible clients, and even the occasional HOA nitpick, but nothing compared to being treated like a stranger in his own neighborhood. Meanwhile, Janice remained at the gate, stiff as a statue. The officers had left, the neighbors had drifted back into their homes, but the weight of humiliation clung to her like humidity on a summer night. Every phone raised in the air, every whisper from the crowd, it all replayed in her mind. She had called 911 expecting validation. Instead, she got a spotlight she didn't want. Inside the dispatch center, Tanya sat with her headset on the desk in front of her, her hands pressed against her face, elbows braced on the table. She wasn't supposed to feel this shaken after years on the job. She'd learned to compartmentalize, but this wasn't another stranger's call.
This was her husband. She had listened as a neighbor, painted him as dangerous, all because he followed a rule. Her supervisor, noticing her pale face, asked gently, "You okay?" "Fine," Tanya lied, pulling her headset back over her ears, but her voice carried a firmness it hadn't before. She needed to hear how this closed out. Back at the gate, Janice wasn't quite finished. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling through her contacts, until she landed on one labeled HOA President Gerald Miles. She hit call, pacing as the line rang. "Gerald, it's Janice," she began the moment he answered. Her voice quivered with pent-up frustration. "You won't believe what just happened. One of our so-called residents, Morris Dunley, refused to let me in, and then he practically sicked the whole neighborhood on me. I had to call the police." Gerald's sigh carried through the phone. "Janice, it's late. What do you want me to do about it?" "I want action," she demanded. "He embarrassed me. He defied me. This sets a terrible precedent for our community." Gerald's tone was sharp now. "Janice, do you realize what you're saying?
You called 911 because someone wouldn't break SCHOA rules? That's not defiance, that's compliance. If anything, you're the one out of line. Her breath caught. You're taking his side. I'm taking the side of common sense, Gerald said firmly. And by tomorrow morning, you can bet half this neighborhood will have the videos online. Think about how that looks for the HOA. Janice ended the call abruptly, her hand trembling. The cracks were widening, and even her allies weren't rushing to defend her. Meanwhile, Tanya sat at her console, reading the final notes logged by the officers. No crime observed, subject identified as homeowner, caller warned of misuse. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a fleeting second. She wanted to pick up her phone and call Janice directly, to tell her exactly what she had done, to let her know the dispatcher she'd cried help to was the very wife of the man she accused. But Tanya stayed quiet. Protocol bound her hands, even when her heart screamed otherwise. Still, fate has a way of revealing what people try to hide. By the next morning, the first videos appeared on social media. One clip filmed by the young man in the baseball cap showed Janice declaring she felt unsafe, as Maurice calmly held his ID out for officers to see. Another clip caught her shouting, "People like him," before the crowd's murmurs drowned her out. The comments poured in. This is what happens when power gets to someone's head. How many times has she done this to other people? Good on Maurice for keeping calm. Maurice sat at his kitchen table, coffee steaming in front of him as he scrolled through the posts. Tanya sat across from him, her hand on his. Their daughter padded sleepily into the kitchen, asking why her parents were up so early. Maurice closed his laptop quickly, not wanting her to see the videos. "Not yet," Tanya whispered. "You know this is going to spread. People are going to find out sooner rather than later." Morris gave a small shrug. Maybe that's the point. Maybe people need to see it. For Janice, the fallout was swift. By noon, an emergency HOA group chat lit up with messages demanding her resignation from the board. Some neighbors wrote long paragraphs about how her behavior embarrassed the community. Others posted screenshots of the video links as proof. Janice fired back in the chat, typing furiously. "This was taken out of context. I was just trying to protect our neighborhood." But context was already lost. The truth had surfaced in the form of video evidence, in the words of her own mouth, and in the calm restraint of the man she had accused. At the dispatch center, Tanya saw the story trending locally and felt a quiet vindication. She hadn't needed to intervene directly. The truth had revealed itself louder than any argument she could have made. Still, a thought lingered. Janice didn't seem like the type to fade quietly into the background. But as the neighborhood backlash grew and the videos spread further, Janice's desperation would push her into decisions
that would make the cracks in her story impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, Stonehaven Estates was buzzing, not with lawnmowers or delivery trucks, but with conversation in cul-de-sacs and along sidewalks. Neighbors exchanged glances, whispered to one another, and replayed the videos that had begun circulating. Janice's phone vibrated non-stop. Texts from neighbors, emails from HOA members, and even voicemails from local reporters flooded her inbox. The story had moved quickly from gossip at the gate to a headline on a neighborhood Facebook page. HOA board, member calls 911 on resident at Stonehaven. She sat at her kitchen table, the blinds pulled tight, scrolling through the flood of comments. Some were harsh,
others even harsher. She's exactly why people don't trust HOA boards. Morris showed more class in 5 minutes than she has in years. Calling 911 over a gate card, ridiculous. Her hands trembled as she read them. Every word chipped away at the authority she had spent years building. She had prided herself on being the neighborhood's watchdog, the one who enforced order when no one else would. And now that same reputation was being flipped against her, weaponized by the very people she thought she represented. The HOA president, Gerald Miles, had already sent her a blunt email. "Janice, until this matter calms, you should step down temporarily. Your presence on the board will only worsen things. The videos are damaging to all of us. Step down." She scoffed, shoving her laptop shut. They didn't understand. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was trying to protect her neighborhood. That was her job. But denial only shielded her so far. The truth was everywhere now, undeniable. The video clips painted a portrait she couldn't control. Her words, "people like him," looped endlessly online, stripped of context, yes, but context didn't matter when the impact was clear. Down the street, Morris sat in his living room, his daughter perched beside him on the couch with her math book open. Tanya stood behind them, her arms folded loosely, as she watched him explain a fraction problem with the same patience he had shown at the gate. Their daughter glanced up suddenly. "Daddy, why are people talking about you on the internet? My friend showed me on her phone." Maurice hesitated. Tanya stepped in softly. "Honey, sometimes people say things that aren't fair. What matters is knowing who we really are." Morris met Tanya's eyes over their daughter's head. The quiet strength between them spoke louder than words. He knew the story wasn't about to vanish, but he also knew they couldn't let it consume their home. Meanwhile, Janice was unraveling faster than she could catch herself. That evening, she walked into the HOA clubhouse, determined to reclaim control. A few board members were there, seated around a long table with files spread across it. Gerald looked up as she entered, his expression weary. "Janice," he said flatly, "this isn't the time." She ignored him. "We can't let social media dictate what happens here. That video was manipulated. People are twisting the story." One board member, a woman named Elaine, leaned forward. "Manipulated. We all saw it, Janice. We heard what you said. It's not about editing, it's about what actually happened." Janice's voice grew sharper. "So you're just going to abandon me? After everything I've done for this neighborhood?" Gerald closed the folder in front of him, his patience thin. "You've done good work in the past, yes, but this was reckless. You called the police over a personal inconvenience, and now our neighborhood is under a microscope. That's not leadership." For the first time, Janice faltered. Her hands gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white. She wanted to scream, to insist she had been right, but the words stuck in her throat. "Finally," she whispered, "he made me feel powerless." Elaine shook her head slowly. "No, Janice, he didn't make you feel powerless. You made yourself powerless by refusing to see him as an equal." The silence that followed cut deeper than any argument. Janice left the clubhouse without another word. The echo of Elaine's sentence bouncing around in her mind like a hammer against glass. At home, she sat in the dark, her phone lighting up with more notifications. Videos had now spread beyond the neighborhood. Regional outlets were picking it up. The comments were relentless, dissecting not just her words, but what they revealed about the assumptions she carried. Her authority, her reputation, her carefully constructed role as protector of Stonehaven Estates, it was all crumbling, and no one was rushing to catch her. But as Janice slipped deeper into denial and shame, Maurice and Tanya were beginning to have conversations that reached beyond that night, about what it meant not only for their family, but for the values of the community around them. The following week felt longer than any Morris could remember. Each morning, as he drove out of Stonehaven Estates, a few neighbors waved, some even stopping to tell him quietly, "We're with you." Others simply looked away, embarrassed perhaps, or unwilling to be caught in the middle. He didn't need their words to know which side of the story they believed. The videos spoke for themselves. At home, life tried to move forward. Tanya went back to her night shifts at the dispatch center, though she caught herself replaying the call every time she put the headset on. Morris worked remotely a few days to stay close, his laptop propped open at the dining table while their daughter practiced piano in the next room. Normal routines were a balm, but underneath, the weight of what had happened lingered. One evening, Morris sat out on the porch, the desert air cooling after the sun dipped low. Tanya joined him, 2 mugs of tea in hand. She passed one to him, then leaned against the railing, her gaze on the quiet street. "You did everything right," she said softly. "You kept calm. You didn't escalate. You showed her for who she is without losing yourself." Morris gave a tired smile, and yet it still came down to me proving I belong. Every time it's the same. ID out, story ready, composure on display. Like living in my own house isn't proof enough. Tanya reached for his hand. "I know. I heard every second of it. And I hated that I couldn't say anything, but the truth came out anyway." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant bark of a dog down the block. Their daughter's laughter drifted from inside, a reminder of the life they'd built despite everything. Morris finally spoke again. "Maybe that's the lesson here. It's not about winning against her. It's about showing our daughter how to stand with dignity, even when you're being dragged through the mud." Tanya squeezed his hand tighter, her voice steady, "And you did exactly that." Across the neighborhood, the HOA was in turmoil. Janice's resignation came quietly, slipped into an email circulated late at night. She wrote 2 sentences. "Effective immediately, I am stepping down from the HOA board. I no longer wish to serve in this role." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the videos, no explanation, just an ending. But endings don't erase consequences. Janice avoided the clubhouse, skipped neighborhood gatherings, and her once frequent patrols through the community vanished. She was a shadow of her former self, her authority stripped away, not by a vote, but by her own actions. For Morris, though, the real resolution wasn't Janice's downfall. It was something quieter. A week later, he walked his daughter to the school bus stop. A few parents stood nearby chatting while kids ran in circles on the sidewalk. A mother turned to him and said, "Hey, Morris, I just want to say, I showed my son that video. I told him this is why it's important to think before judging people. You handled yourself with grace. That mattered." Morris nodded, gratitude in his eyes, though he kept his words simple. "Thank you. That means a lot." At home that evening, Tanya told him she'd heard similar comments at work. Colleagues had read the story, and one dispatcher had admitted, "If it were me on the line, I might have believed the caller at first. Seeing the truth play out, it was eye-opening."
Morris leaned back in his chair, reflecting. Maybe that's what we take from this. We can't control what people assume, but we can control how we respond, and sometimes that response changes more than we realize. The weight of the week lifted just enough for him to exhale, really exhale, for the first time since that night at the gate. As the sun set outside their living room window, Tanya closed her laptop and looked at Morris. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you lost your temper? If you shouted back? If you gave her what she wanted? Morris didn't hesitate. Yeah, and that's why I didn't. There it was, the resolution. Not a shouted apology from Janice, but the quiet truth that dignity had carried him through. Their daughter would remember that. Neighbors had witnessed it. And even if Janice never admitted it, she had been forced to see her assumptions collapse under the weight of reality. But though the chapter was closing, one question remained for everyone who had watched it unfold. What kind of community did they want Stonehaven Estates to be going forward? A week had passed, yet the echo of that night at the gate still lingered in Stonehaven Estates. People whispered less now, but the memory lived on. In conversations over fences, in cautious glances during morning jogs, in the way neighbors looked at each other with a little more awareness than before. Maurice, though, had no desire to dwell on it forever. For him, the measure of that evening wasn't Janice's collapse or the online attention that had spread like wildfire. It was what his family carried away from it. One Saturday morning, he sat at the kitchen table, his daughter across from him, with crayons scattered in front of her. She was drawing their house, complete with the front gate. She looked up suddenly and asked, "Daddy, why did that lady call the police on you if you didn't do anything wrong?" The question landed heavier than any online comment ever could. Morris glanced at Tanya, who stood at the counter, pouring coffee. Her expression soft, but bracing for his answer. Morris leaned forward, folding his hands. Sometimes people make quick judgments about others without really knowing them. And when they let those judgments take over, they can make mistakes that hurt people. What matters is how we handle it. I stayed calm, I told the truth, and the truth showed itself. His daughter frowned in concentration, then went back to coloring. "So you showed her you weren't bad?" Morris nodded. "Exactly. And not just her, everyone else too." Tanya carried 2 mugs to the table. Setting one beside him, she kissed the top of their daughter's head before sitting down. "And what you did, Morris, taught her something even more important, that she never has to fight fire with fire. She can stand tall without shouting." The room was quiet for a moment.
filled only with the scratch of crayon on paper. Outside, a neighbor jogged past with a wave, pausing just long enough to say, "Morning, Dunleys." It was simple, ordinary, but the sincerity in the tone felt different now. Meanwhile, Janice had all but disappeared from community life. She no longer chaired HOA meetings, no longer monitored lawns, or sent strongly worded emails. Her once proud voice had grown silent. For some, it was a relief. For others, it was a reminder of how power, when unchecked, could curdle into something destructive. Morris didn't celebrate her downfall. He didn't need to. What mattered was that the neighborhood had seen it all for themselves. The cameras, the lights, the officers, the neighbors. It had all stripped away any room for denial. Tanya reflected on it during her next shift at the dispatch center. Sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, headset snug once more, she looked around at the other operators. She thought of how easily she could have believed Janice that night if it had been anyone else on the line. It was a sobering realization. How much power rests in the words people choose to use when they call for help. Later that evening, she said quietly to Maurice,
It scares me how one phone call can shape everything. How someone's story can paint you guilty before you even speak. Maurice gave her hand a squeeze. And that's why we have to live in a way that tells our story before anyone else can. That night, it didn't define us. How we handled it did. The truth was life had moved on. Their daughter still played piano in the evenings. Tanya still worked her long shifts. Morris still jogged around the block before logging into meetings. But beneath those routines, something had changed. Something in the community, and something within themselves. It wasn't about Janice anymore. It was about what the incident revealed. That assumptions, when left unchecked, can burn through trust faster than any wildfire. That authority doesn't excuse prejudice. That calmness in the face of false accusation can carry a power louder than shouting. And maybe most importantly, that silence in the crowd doesn't last forever. People do speak up. Cameras record. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when someone tries to bury it. As Maurice sat with Tanya later that night, their daughter asleep down the hall, he leaned back on the couch, eyes on the ceiling. I don't want to be remembered for what Janice did to me. I'd rather be remembered for how we stood through it, for how we carried ourselves. Tanya rested her head against his shoulder. You will be. We all will be. The lesson was simple, though not easy. Judgment without understanding leads to harm. And sometimes, the greatest act of strength is refusing to let someone else's prejudice dictate who you are. To the viewer, the story might feel like one neighborhood dispute, but it carried something bigger, something universal. We've all been in moments where we are judged unfairly, where someone's assumptions paint us as something we are not. The choice we face in those moments is the same Maurice faced at the gate. Do we let anger dictate our response? Or do we hold steady and let the truth reveal itself? And so as this story comes to a close, I'll leave you with that lesson. Dignity is louder than accusation. And truth, when held firmly, always surfaces. If this story resonated with you,
if it reminded you of moments in your own life where you chose composure over chaos. Make sure to subscribe. More stories are on the way. Stories that reflect not only conflict, but the choices we make when the spotlight is on us. Because at the end of the day, it's not the accusation that defines us. It's how we respond.